All right, so what we're looking at is the Chapter 11 handout, the first question, going back to value at risk. Okay. If we have an expected value of 515,000 euros in 60 days, if there's no change in the value of the euro, then we will receive 719,610. Of course, we recognize there can be some changes, and the euro could either strengthen or weaken. Even though we have a 0% expected change, we have a standard deviation of 4.5% associated with that prediction. If we go out 1.65 standard deviations away from the mean, 1.65 times 4.5% is negative 7.425%, which means the euro could weaken to 129.36, at which point our receivables will be worth 666,178, and we're back to our old friend value at risk at 53,431. Okay. Now remember, this value at risk is just a statistical term. It's trying to show us where everybody's using the same methodology, and this is just the methodology someone picked. Okay. A lot of times, as I said before, when banks were using it for stress testing during the financial crisis, they used value at risk methodologies. So that way, every bank would be using the same methodology to evaluate their exposure. And they were really looking for exposure to interest rate movements. Okay. But if everyone's using different risk measures, then it's going to be harder. So they just picked one. So this is kind of a standard format, and it's probably why the book included it. Value at risk is just kind of something that lots of people use. Okay. But in all honesty, it's kind of impractical when you're trying to explain this to other people. Okay. Because the value at risk is just sort of like a threshold amount. Okay. You're 95% certain that the receivables will be worth at least 666,000. Therefore, we've got some small probability of losing about or receiving about 53,000 less than we anticipated. Okay. So it's just kind of like a ballpark worst case scenario methodology. Okay. What more people are interested in is not continuous distributions because they're hard to explain. But a lot of times people use discrete probability distributions. Okay. And that's a little bit easier to explain to someone. Okay. If you said, hey, and if you look at number 2, it says, suppose the firm obtained the following forecast. Okay. So maybe some company came up and said, hey, I think there's about a 30% chance the euro will be at $1.39. A 20% chance it drops down to $1.37. A 20% chance it goes up to $1.41. Okay. A 10% chance it drops down to $1.34. 5% it drops down to $1.30, and so forth. Now, this will look like a normal distribution, but it's not exactly a normal distribution. This is just a discrete probability distribution, meaning we're giving outcomes within some range and we're describing it. Okay. Now, what's nice about this is people can see, hey, I can see exactly what the receivables worth and what's the probability that that occurs. Okay. And so then they can make decisions. In fact, we're going to use this discrete probability distribution in Chapter 11 to come up with some expected values, to come up with some what we call cost of hedging versus not hedging. And it's just a little bit simpler methodology. Okay. So the first thing we have to figure out is how do we find the expected value of the receivables. Okay. Well, if you look on here and I say, hey, there's a 5% chance that our receivables will be worth $669,500. Now, how'd I get the 669,500? The 669,500 was the fact that there's 515,000 euros coming in. And if the euro drops down to $1.30, then our receivables will be worth 669,500. So the value of these receivables is 515,000 times the spot rate that you're predicting will occur. All right. Now, if we take the probability times the outcome, and we can do it for each one of these. Okay. And then we sum them up. Oops, that didn't work. Oh, hold on. Probability times the outcome. Huh. This thing's too small. And sum them up, we get what's known as a weighted average outcome. So the probability times the outcome summed up gives us basically a weighted average. Okay. I know some people like to find an average by adding all the numbers up and dividing by n, but you can't do that here because they're not equally likely to occur. Okay. So we can't use sort of a average because we've got different probabilities associated with different outcomes. So we have to use what's called a weighted average. And a weighted average is just the probability times the outcome summed up. Okay. So notice that our weighted average estimate is a little bit different than when we use the value at risk measure. Okay. With the value at risk measure, okay, we were using a uniform distribution. It was continuous, and it was a normal distribution. What you're seeing down below is someone's expectations. It is a somewhat uniform distribution, but it's not exactly perfectly normal. Okay. So what happens is a discrete distribution on a weighted average basis is likely to have a different average than if we used the value at risk measure. Okay. So once we see that, it's okay. Okay, it's fairly similar. But by finding a weighted average, we're doing it a little bit differently than if we used a continuous probability distribution. So we're going to end up using this forecast because it's easier to explain to people. That's probably why they picked it. Okay? Especially people with non-statistical backgrounds. When you start talking mean and standard deviations, you tend to lose some of your colleagues. Okay? So, what are some of the ways that we can hedge this risk. Okay, we've got a risk. The risk is we can receive less than we expect or more than we expect. And if we want to remove this risk, we're going to have to come up with different methodologies to eliminate this risk. We've already talked about one. One of them we talked about was using a rollover spot hedge. That's not mentioned in the book, but what is mentioned is money market hedges, forward hedges, futures hedges, and options hedges. Okay. So that's kind of what we're getting into today, is looking at these different sorts of hedges. Now, here's the first question. A money market hedge. What is a money market security? So before we can figure out what a money market hedge is, we've got to figure out what a money market security is. Now, I know many of you know what a money market security is because you've taken investments and we just went over them. What are money market securities? Anyone? All right. Lama, are you in my investments class?
Yes.
What's a money market security?
I don't know. I forgot. Is it mutual fund?
No. Chapter 9.
I forgot.
Chapter 9? All right.
Sorry.
Who else is in there? Megan, you're in there. What's a money market security?
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes. I just need a second.
Chapter 9.
I don't know. I'm looking at like the T-bills and
A
the.
treasury bill is a money market security, but a treasury bond is not. Why would a treasury bill be a money market security, but a treasury bond not be?
I don't know.
Okay. All right, Stephen, are you in that? You're in that one, aren't you, Stephen?
Yes.
All right, money market security. Why is a T-bill, treasury bill, money market security? What's unique about money market securities? Maybe we should ask that on the question, on the test.
I forget about it.
Man, long Easter break. All right, who else is in there? Charlie, you're in there?
Money market securities, short-term investments that are highly secure and liquid. They typically come in blocks of at least $1 million.
Good. What else is unique about it?
Don't they have little to no risk?
Many of them do, yes. Yes. But the main feature is what? The main feature is they don't have a coupon payment. They're pure discount securities. Which means what? you pay less than the face value today, is why they sell on a discount basis. You pay less than the face value today, and you get the face value at maturity. Okay. So what's nice about money market securities is that we don't have to worry about coupon payments. We don't have to worry about reinvestment risk. It's sort of a pure form of a interest rate. Okay. And what's nice is like the government a lot of times issues money market securities like treasury bills. Okay. But companies can also issue money market securities. Okay. Most of them come in the form of something called commercial paper. And commercial paper was a type of money market security. So what's nice about these is that they don't have the other types of risks associated with it as bonds, for instance, do. And bonds tend to be longer term. And we didn't really get into it, but if you buy a bond today and sell it early, you face interest rate risk. Okay? And you also face reinvestment risk on the coupon payments. Okay? So money market securities tend to ignore these two risks, which is why money market securities tend to be less risky. Okay? They tend to be very liquid, and they do tend to be in large denominations. Okay? Because most people that use money market securities are corporations. Okay? So anyway, it gets a little bit tricky, okay? But you can both issue money market securities, okay? And you can purchase money market securities. Okay? So what it does, it lets us essentially be able to borrow and lend at a specified interest rate. And so the book doesn't really talk about it, but all it does is really confuse things. But most people think about borrowing and lending money and going through a bank. But if you want to cut out the middleman, you can borrow or lend in the capital markets as long as you're a well-known company. And you can issue money market securities and you can purchase money market securities. If you're purchasing money market securities, it means you're essentially lending money out. Okay? And if you're issuing money market securities, it means that you're borrowing money. This is from the corporate perspective. Okay? So in order to make it simple, though, the book kind of, and I stick with it too, but it kind of dilutes the fact of why they're called money market hedges. Okay? Because the money market hedges means that you're going into the money market arena. And companies are going in there to borrow and lend directly with each other.
Did you say that if you issue one, that means that you're borrowing, and if you purchase, that means you're lending?
That's correct.
So it's like the opposite of what your brain would actually want you to think?
Well, yes, because you're thinking as an individual as opposed to a company.
Right.
Right. So
Okay.
think about this. When you go into the bank to borrow money to buy a car, okay, the bank is really assessing your risk when it's lending you the money. Okay. So when you're borrowing money from the bank is lending you money. And when you walk into the bank and you deposit money into, say, like a savings account or a bank CD, you're actually buying a bank certificate of deposit. And when you're doing that, you're actually lending the bank money, even though you bought a bank CD. And the bank is actually borrowing money from you when they're issuing that bank CD. So the same thing kind of happens. It just happens at the corporate level It just depends on what side of the coin you're looking at. Okay. And so in this case, when we talk about a lot of times commercial paper, there are some certificates of deposit, but most of the time there's things like commercial paper. And there's some other banker's acceptance is another thing that gets bought and sold in the money market arena. Okay. But most individuals never really enter this money market. That's why it's kind of hard for us to know exactly what a money market is as an average person, because you would never really come across it as an individual. Okay. But companies use the money market securities all the time. Okay. So we'll kind of stick to the book methodology of borrowing and lending. Okay. But remember, when you're borrowing money, okay, so let's look at this receivables idea. Okay. The receivables are coming due in 60 days and they're 515,000 euros. Okay. What you would do, and I'll only say it once, and then if it doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. Okay. If you have 515,000 euros due in 60 days, what you want to do is actually issue a 515,000 euro face value money market security. Now, you may not be able to do it in that exact denomination, but you could probably issue one for 500,000. But essentially what you're doing when you're issuing that security is that you are borrowing a certain amount of money today in euros. Okay. Now remember that money market securities are sold at a discount. Okay. So what happens is if you issue a 515,000 euro face value security and the interest rate is 7.75%. Yeah. What that means is someone's only going to give you 508,433 euros today. And they'll give you those euros today in exchange for 515,000 euros in 60 days. Yeah. Now, the main question is, how do we come up with the 508,433? Okay. Well, if you look up at the top of the screen, how do you find the present value of 515,000 at 7.75% interest rate, but only for 60 days? Okay. Well, in this case, let me switch to a different screen. I'll write
Can
it.
you share your screen?
Am I not sharing it right now?
No.
All right. Sorry. Oops. That would be helpful. All right. So we have 515,000 due in 60 days. Okay. Essentially, what you're going to do today is issue a 515,000 euro face value security. But what you're going to get for it today is the present value of that. Okay. So let me go ahead and write it out. All right. So what you can see is oh, was this 90 days or 60 days? Ah, now I can't remember what it was.
It was 60.
Okay. This one says 90 for some reason. All right, maybe I don't have the right things matched up. All right, change it to 60. This should be 60 days, sorry. Everything should match up with what's above. This was 60 days. This needs to be 60 days. Sorry about that. I'll change it. All right, so what we have is 515,000 euros coming in 60 days from our accounts receivables. What you want to set up today is that you want to essentially borrow against those receivables. So if you issue a money market that's going to pay a face value of 515,000 euros to whoever buys it, okay? Then essentially what you're going to do is just transfer these receivables to the buyer, okay? And what the buyer is going to pay you is something less than 515,000. How much less? It depends on what the interest rate is. And if the interest rate is 7.5% a year for 60 days, then you will receive today €508,642. So if you sold a money market security, and that's why it's called a money market hedge, if you sold a money market security to someone that was going to pay them 515,000 euros in 60 days, and how are you going to pay them that? When your receivables come in, you'll just transfer it over to them. Okay. But they're not going to give you $515,000 today. They're going to give you something less than that. And that's why these money market securities are called discount securities. So they're going to pay you a discount today relative to the value of the security. Okay. So if they pay you 508,642 euros today, okay, you're going to use the accounts receivable to pay them back in the future. Okay. And what's nice is you know what the spot rate is. Since the spot rate today is known, you've eliminated your risk. Okay. But we need to compare this on an apples to apples basis. Okay. So what we need to do in order to compare this on an apples to apples basis is we need to take the 508,642 euros, which is what we received today for selling the money market security. And we need to convert that into dollars today. And since the spot rate is known, and we go back up here to the top, the spot rate's $1.3973. Since the spot rate today is known, we can convert the euros we received from the sale of the money market security into dollars. And I'm kind of rounding off here. Yeah. But one of the problems is this is day $0. And we really want to compare our hedge to an unhedged position. We need to use day $60 to day $60. Okay. So what we need to do is take this money and issue a buy a money market security denominated in dollars. So what happens is when we first started out, what we really did, and this is the term that most people use and what the book uses, we borrowed against the receivables in euros. And then in order to make an apples to apples comparison, we'll need to invest the US dollars for 60 days using some sort of appropriate dollar denominated interest rate. And what it turns out is if we go back to the problem, we can see that in the money market hedge, we could sell the dollars, or excuse me, we would get 508,433 euros today, which we convert into dollars. And then we need to move the dollars forward at some interest rate. And when we're investing, we're essentially lending the money out. So if you took 710,143 and we earned 1% for 60 days, it should give us 711,617. So what we're able to do is compare US dollars on day 60 to maybe something we'd compared day $60 we'd receive without the hedge. So basically what the money market hedge does is it takes our accounts receivables, which has a lot of risk associated with it, and it converts it into US dollars that are known with certainty on day 60. So this is what we had using the money market hedge. And no matter what happens to the spot rate in the future, our money market hedge will always give us 711,617. And now what we can do is compare it to our forecast, and we can easily show where we're better off hedging versus not hedging. Now remember, since this is accounts receivable, we didn't really care with accounts receivable if the euro strengthened. So obviously, if the euro strengthened to 145, then our receivables in 60 days would be worth a lot more than what we expected them to be worth. In fact, they would be worth 746,750. And we could compare that to the money market hedge. Now remember, if we used the money market hedge, all we needed to know was the spot rate today. And also what interest rates were in terms of money market securities. So if we look at the difference between not hedging and hedging, okay, and we subtract this difference, we get something called a cost-benefit analysis. Okay. And so we can see if we decided to hedge and the euro strengthened, then we'd be worse off in hindsight by about $35,000 if it strengthened to $1.45. However, the reason we hedged was what happens if the euro weakens. If the euro weakens and we don't hedge, then our receivables will only be worth $669,500. But if we hedge, we've locked in a value. Notice that they're all the same because that's what the hedge does. Okay. The hedge locks in the value of the receivables irregardless of what happens to the spot rate. In this case, the hedge worked out to be a benefit. Okay. So the book uses something called the real cost of hedging, or cost of hedging. So a negative cost is what I refer to as a benefit. So in this case, if you got to subtract one from the other, it's just however you want to term it. Yeah. So the book says, hey, if you take no hedge minus hedge and you get a negative number, then that turns out to be a benefit, or what they refer to as a negative cost. But I don't like using the term negative cost. Okay. So this is a benefit. This would be a cost. Okay. So now you can kind of see, and you can show it in chart format. You would be better off hedging according to your forecast. You're better off hedging about 35% of the time. You would be better off not hedging about 65% of the time. So not hedging would be favorable. So this seems to be something that people, when you're trying to explain risk to them, okay, is that, hey, not hedging results in a more favorable outcome about 65% of the time, whereas if you hedged, you're only better off about 35% of the time. Okay. But you want to be a little bit careful, because it's not just probability its probability and magnitude. It's kind of like the life insurance. Okay? If I go out and buy life insurance, the only payoff occurs is if I have an accidental death, which is bad. Okay? But the implications of that are rather high because I lose out on all of my remaining income. So I might even go buy life insurance, even though the probability is low, but the adverse impact of that happening is high. So if I figure, hey, I might be able to still make $1 million if I keep working over the next 30 years. But if I die, I won't have a chance to earn that. So I might buy $1 million life insurance policy, not for me, but for my family members. And it might be worth it for me to spend money because the adverse impact of an unlikely event, I'm assuming it's unlikely, okay, very low probability of occurring, but the magnitude is high. So what we want to do is be careful, and this is useful right here, okay? You're better off hedging only about 35% of the time, and not hedging is favorable 65% of the time, but you want to be able to explain the magnitudes as well, okay? So what we do is come up with another weighted average. But now we're finding a weighted average of the cost of hedging. And we get something called the expected cost of hedging. And what this is on average, hedging will cost us about $3,000 on average. What does that mean? Obviously, if the expected cost of hedging were negative, that means that there's a benefit to hedging, and it would be a no-brainer. Okay? If hedging results in a negative cost, okay, or it results in a net benefit, then it's pretty easy to decide. Okay? Hedging is worthwhile because hedging expects to benefit us. Okay? In this case, though, hedging is expected to cost us. Okay? On average, it costs us about $3,000. Okay? But what does that $3,000 do? It removes all the risk. Okay? Now, when you're presenting this, you might say, hey, we're better off hedging about 35% of the time. Not hedging is more favorable outcome about 65% of the time. On average, it would cost us about $3,000 to hedge. So then you have to decide, hey, maybe hedging is worthwhile. Sort of like the life insurance. Someone says, well, $60 a month for your life insurance policy. You're like, oh, that's not bad. Okay. That's $720 a year. That's not too bad. Okay. Maybe I'll take that for $100,000 of coverage. Okay. And even though I don't want it to happen, obviously I'm hoping not to die. Okay. I might still be willing to pay $60 a month for $100,000 of coverage, even though it has an expected cost to me. But it does provide some risk reduction in terms of adverse outcomes. All right, let me see if there's any questions on that chart. Does that kind of make sense? So we set up our forecast, we set up the probabilities, we figure out what our receivables are worth without a hedge, figure out what our receivables are worth if we hedge. Then we subtract the difference and find a weighted average. We can also then interpret the results by looking at the cumulative probabilities of when hedging is effective versus the cumulative probability when leaving it unhedged would be effective. All right, so that's sort of the methodology that the book has chosen as a way to present this material to other people. All right. The money market hedge is just one of the hedges that we can use. There are others. All right, the other one would be a forward hedge. Let's go ahead and look. All right, describe a theoretical forward transaction that will hedge the exchange rate exposure. Assume you could get a forward rate from the bank at $1.3915. So remember, we start out, we figure out where are the different values that the euro could go. Here's where we are now. Here's the different values it could go in 60 days. Here's what our accounts receivable is worth at each of these values. But if we locked in a forward rate, then we would call the bank and say, hey, I want to buy 515,000 euros forward. The problem is most forward transactions are for large transactions. So that's why I kind of said theoretical forward rate. But if you could get a forward rate for 515,000 euros and it was at $1.3915, and you agreed to call the bank and set up what's called a short forward position with the bank, then you'd wait for day 60 when the accounts receivables come in. You sell them to the bank at the agreed upon rate. And 515,000 euros at $1.3915 means no matter what happens to the spot rate, the bank's going to give you 116,623. That's a forward position, okay, if we could get it from the bank. And let me go ahead. Give me just a second. And let's look at what a forward hedge would look like compared to our forecast. So if we look here compared to our forecast, with the forward hedge, notice the forward hedge, we're getting 716, 623. Here was no hedge, what the receivables would be worth. Here's what they're worth with a forward hedge. And you can see the forward hedge is a lot better than the money market hedge, because the forward hedge says we're better off 65% of the time. We're better off hedging. And 35% of the time, better to have no hedge. And you can see when we find the weighted average of these, we get a expected benefit. So I just ran in and used the same probability distribution from above. It's not on our sheet, I just copied it and pasted it in. But you can see now that the forward hedge, if we could get it at 139.15, then the forward hedge would give us a locked-in value of the receivables at 716,623. And you can see that that's better off about 65% of the time. Now, 35% of the time, you do better with no hedge. But again, we not just want probabilities, but we want to know the magnitude of the impact. So we need to find a weighted average of the cost and benefits. And that tells us that there is an expected benefit to hedging. All right, I'll leave that up for just a second. All right. Any questions so far on money market hedges or forward hedges? All right. Well, I don't want to start the futures hedge with 4 minutes left. So see if there's any other questions. If not, we'll go ahead and call it a little early today. 3 minutes early, unless we have any questions. All right, feel free to read through chapter 11. It will be helpful. You'll see that this follows along chapter 11 pretty closely. And if there aren't any questions, then we'll see you on Wednesday. Question? No. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday then.